Continuing to follow that massive breaking news out of Russia, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, speaking only minutes ago, where he has vowed to neutralise and ordered those who are responsible for this coup attempt to be neutralised. Those are his words. He was speaking in what was a relatively short address. In addition, Moscow, all public events have been cancelled. Not too much of a surprise there. And Wagner troops, they do seem to be approaching Moscow. As it stands, they're about halfway there. They have reportedly taken another city, no resistance. So in terms of how they'll move on, we'll have to wait and see in that. And in the past few minutes, Foreign Minister Penny Wong's office, they've just responded to 6 News. They say, in regards to the ongoing situation, no comment at this time. Let's continue this coverage with GovCheck editor and the host of Between Park Space and Capitol Hill, Stuart Jeffrey. Stuart, good to have you here once again. What are some of the latest developments and what do we know about this continuing to unfold situation?
We may not have anything from Penny Wong, but the British Ministry of Defence took to Twitter less than an hour ago, and described what is happening right now as the greatest security threat to the Russian state in recent times. So, as we said last time, the West is recognizing that this is going to be potentially a big change. It'll really shake up the power in Russia if it succeeds. And even if it fails, you've wiped out the Wagner mercenary group, which is one of their main forces in Ukraine. So even if they lose, it's still a major blow to Russia.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary what's going on, and what's especially going on with these troops and these forces from the Wagner group. We're hearing Wagner posters and propaganda in Moscow is actually starting to be removed, and that's saying something, because the whole group is now affiliated with this anti-Putin sentiment now. Quite extraordinary, and to see this develop in really less than 12 hours has just been amazing to see. Again, Putin, it was a short address. He said this is treason. This is echoing the line we've heard earlier from Russian officials. He's called it treason. He said it's a he said it's treason, but again, ordering those responsible for the coup attempt to be neutralised. Whether that coup attempt will be successful or not, we'll have to wait and see. We know an arrest warrant for the Wagner leader is already out. But going on what we were discussing a couple of hours ago, Stuart, it seems possible, and the Wagner people are already claiming that they've got Russian troops on their side, but it seems possible that maybe Russian National Guard might flip here.
Yeah, certainly we're not going to see large numbers flip. Again, they are Putin loyalists. But 115 National Guardsmen were fired for refusing to get involved and in the combat in Ukraine. So there are definitely dissenting factions there. It's not going to be the biggest pull for Wagner and any allies to Prigozhin, but there will definitely be a shift up there. It really depends on which National Guardsmen decide to turn coat as to how much that will really matter. But regardless, it will offer the Wagner group some more manpower in Moscow, which is what they desperately need.
Do you think, because Putin said in that that those who are affiliated with Wagner who flip in terms of supporting Putin, that they'll be safe and all that? Would you believe that? I mean, it's sounding like I've completely forgotten what analogy to put in, but it sounds, I don't know, too good to be true. Maybe
I've got one word for you: ex-KGB.
I think that's two. How many words in KGB?
Anyway, my point is, no, it's he worked for the KGB. I think he was I can't remember if he was a lieutenant colonel or...
He was high up. He was high up from what I understand, or at least... But he was good as well as what I understand as well.
He was, I think, deployed in East Germany from around 1985 to try and help crack down on dissenters in East Germany and make sure that puppet state towed the line. So he knows what he's doing when it comes to suppressing dissenters, and I think he'll take a very hard line once this coup's dealt with, if the coup fails.
It is extraordinary to see how fast these Wagner troops are moving again. Essentially abandoning Ukraine almost, and I'm sure Ukraine wouldn't be too upset with that. And they're moving towards, again, Moscow, about halfway there, possibly closer. Troops are being set up by, and I'll try to, if I'm, and we'll both try to do this, unless we specifically mean Wagner troops, assume we're talking about Russian military. But there are troops being set up, non-Wagner troops being set up near the entry to Moscow. And again, all public events cancelled, real heightened security. A counter-terrorism response has now been initiated there. What do you reckon about that, Stuart? They are really taking this seriously. I mean, they seem to be preparing for a total possible Wagner on the street fighting at this point.
Yeah, we have seen the M4 highway cut to Vorosnev has been cut, so there are definitely steps being taken, both in terms of preventing the Wagner troops from getting in, but also to prevent civilians from leaving. We have seen stay-at-home orders put in place in Moscow.
Gee, sounds like it's COVID coverage then. I haven't heard that phrase for a while.
Shelter-in-place orders put in place in Moscow, just like we saw happen in Rostov-on-Don just a few hours earlier. So we are seeing very much a similar response, although this time round, the Russians have had time to prepare, and it will not be an easy fight for the Wagner group.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see what's going on there, because again, it appears a lot, like still there's obviously a lot more Russian to Wagner, although Wagner is Russian, but you know what I mean. But there's still a lot of people supporting Wagner and who are affiliated with Wagner, and also they're also claiming that they have people flipping those who have been on the front lines. And remember, the whole thing that the Wagner boss has been going on about is that he's essentially been infuriated. There was a video he was ranting and raving over perceived failures on the battlefield, and he's been really up at the Chief of General Staff and also the Defense Minister there in Russia, a bit less Putin, but more so those two. He's demanded to see them. Now, we were speculating they're probably not going to a few hours ago. After this Putin address, Stuart, I think it's safe to say they are not going to go there. They are not handing him over. And he said if they don't hand him over, they're going to move to Moscow. So it sounds like they're moving to Moscow.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that would not surprise me at all. We do know that people like the chief of staff are Putin loyalists. They wouldn't be there if they weren't. I'm not going to try and pronounce Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of staff. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Minister for Defense's last name. But these are both men who were involved with the Soviet military. This core around Putin will be unlikely to shift.
Yeah, it's interesting, and of course Putin, I mean, took him a while to address. It was initially scheduled for top of the hour a couple of hours ago, then was delayed indefinitely. Then 15 minutes after that, he comes out and speaks. Not for that long, mind you, only a couple of minutes relatively, and he's done longer addresses. I think his address announcing the start of the invasion of Ukraine was at least longer than that. But again, Stuart, when he says that he's ordering those responsible for the attempt to be neutralised, I mean, you can really only take that one way.
XKGB, yes. Anyone who, if the coup attempt is to lose, anyone and everyone, even remotely tied to it, will be probably shot on the spot. Honestly, or if not, there'll be a mock trial, a grand affair to try and then obviously convict those who attempted the coup. And I wouldn't be surprised if even some Russian soldiers who weren't as, say, vigorous in the actions they took to stop the Wagner group, if they won't suffer similar fates. It, I'm not. It won't get to the scale of the purges undertaken by Stalin in the 1930s. But after this, there will definitely be some purges, and anyone who remotely dissents against Putin regardless of whether or not they're tied to the Wagner group, will be taken out and shot behind the shed. Or at
Do
least
you think they're going to have a more of a hard line approach? Because I know always people talk about Putin cracking down on dissent, but still, do you think it could get even more hard line here? And especially also internally regarding their military forces and their affiliated forces like the Wagner Group, given, again, there's a difference between the Wagner Group and the official Russian military forces, although both fighting against Ukraine, but still the Wagner leader has just been fuming in the past few months against especially the Russian Defense Minister and Chief of General Staff.
Let's not forget, up until now, Putin has at least been required to have some semblance of democracy. As we said earlier, he briefly stood down as president to put a puppet in place instead for one term. That way he wouldn't have 3 terms in a row.
Forget that now, though, of course.
Alexei Navalny, who's the opposition leader, he's an ex-lawyer. He's currently in prison. He has not been executed. He's in prison. There has that been that semblance of democracy. This coup attempt could be the final straw, the final thing that Putin needs to reassert total control over the country. We do know that he has lamented the fall of the Soviet Union. He's on record as having said that. So we know he has these authoritarian tendencies, and this is his excuse he needs. I'm not going to the extent of saying that this is a setup for him to assert more power, but if the coup attempt fails, it will be used to gain more power for Putin and his allies, although probably just Putin.
Obviously, he appeared calm in that address. He, which is, I guess, is his usual style anyway. But do you think him and maybe those closest to him, they might be seriously worried about this? And again, we talked about before how, you can lose Moscow but not have a successful coup attempt.
Yeah, he has plenty of places to retreat to. As I mentioned earlier, the Air Force and the Navy don't really work with the Wagner group, so there's not going to, if there is rebellion from the Navy or the Air Force, I would not expect that to come from Wagner. That would be a third-party operation. So there are these core groups that Putin can rely on. And of course, the ex-KGB officers are still located all throughout Russia in a variety of intelligence roles or military roles. And I don't doubt that he can call on those men as well to come to his aid. So most of the leadership positions are filled by ex-KGB officers, or at least all the high up ones are. So there is this cadre, this core around Putin that will be hard to be infiltrated by anyone, and I don't expect anything to challenge his leadership from that position. It will have to be an outside force, is my best bet there. But yes, he has plenty of places within Russia that he can go to. Outside of Russia, China, Belarus, that's about it. But within Russia, yes, he can certainly go north to St. Petersburg, east of Vladivostok, to the Ural Mountains. He's got a variety of places that he can go to within Russia because it is the biggest country in the world.
And just some breaking news, by the way, Stuart. You'll mention the Air Force there. Apparently, according to some local reports, Russian aviation forces are conducting strikes on Wagner groups who are currently moving towards Moscow.
Yeah, well, the Wagner group, from what I know of the Russian military, the Wagner group is not likely to have much in the way of even helicopters. Really, there's not much of an anti-air or air-to-air presence there, so they are vulnerable because they are, to try and get to Moscow as fast as possible, they are having to take roads, and there is no direct route per se to Moscow. So the Russian army can take advantage of that. In fact, they're using ground support style tactics in the Air Force that are common in NATO countries. Actually, there are some parallels there, and we're going to see. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing bombing on Rostov on Don yet, because it's Putin. He doesn't care much about civilian losses. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing that if the coup attempt becomes any more serious.
You mentioned helicopters there. That's the other thing. On the other side of thing, Russian military helicopters 3 of them reportedly shot down. And we saw that footage earlier that we were playing a couple hours ago. We'll bring that up on screen now. This was apparently the aftermath of one of those, possibly, not confirmed. But it has been reported at least 3 military helicopters have been shot down. Again, if you're just joining us, continuing coverage of the ongoing situation in Russia with that coup attempt. And in terms of the response here in Australia, all we have so far, Foreign Minister Penny Wong's office tells 6 News, a very brief comment, no comment at this stage. So not much coming there. Would we expect something, maybe the Prime Minister or other ministers speaking about this, because it's not something that can be ignored, but I guess like we were discussing a few hours ago, they probably want to make sure everything they're saying is confirmed, especially given there's every chance this could be over soon if Russian forces really go at Wagner, or at the same time it could drag on for days.
And it really depends on whether or not they get Putin. If they get Putin, it's pretty easy. If they don't get Putin, we will have a civil war. Unless they get taken out, which is also a possibility, the coup attempt could quite easily lose. So your options are civil war, success, failure. I don't. The most likely to me seems to be the civil war. I doubt that the coup attempt will succeed. Civil war seems most likely right now, but we could quite easily see if that's going to depend on the next 24 hours. If they can take Moscow, is the key question there. If they can't take Moscow in the next 24 hours, they can't take Moscow because right now they aren't prepared. They're having to use riot police in Moscow to prepare to fight the Wagner group because they aren't prepared to fight the military force of this size in Moscow. If they can't use these elements of surprise and take ground now, then they're not going to be able to. It's the exact same thing in Ukraine. They had the element of surprise when they first attacked, and then it's become a bit more stagnated since then. So it's the exact same Russian tactics being used. If they don't take Moscow soon, they can't take it.
And in regards to the Wagner leader and his, I guess, allies, the last we heard was that they're in Rostov-on-Don. Given, firstly, there was an arrest warrant for him, now orders for those responsible to be neutralised, do you reckon they might try to stay there and avoid going on the front line and leading the troops formally?
Look, it definitely wouldn't surprise me that we wouldn't see anything like that, given the situation. Anything is possible, but that's probably definitely it's definitely likely that we could see something like that for sure.
And of course, the other thing that we can't forget here is that there aren't many allies to Russia, are there? So go on to that, because we've discussed it before. It's really just Belarus and China nearby.
Yeah, so you've got the BRICS alliance there, which is kind of the anti-NATO. You've got Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. China would probably give refuge because Russia and China need each other because they can split America's attention. They need each other, so China would likely give backing to Russia. They have suggested that they would mediate, but we don't know how reliable it is because, again, it is China, and the US would be reluctant to use them to mediate anything anyway. Brazil is a non player here. That's mostly an economic thing. There's mostly an economic consideration there for Brazil in terms of working with BRICS. So they're out of the picture. India again probably out of the picture. There's some rough ties there. I definitely wouldn't see India getting involved. They also rely on the West for a fair amount of stuff right now as well. And there is rivalry between India and China that really just leaves South Africa right now. There were plans for Putin to visit, I believe next month, it could have been August, to visit South Africa. Under South African law, they would be required to hand him over to The Hague for trial for war crimes, which he has been accused of. There's a warrant out for his arrest. The government of South Africa wants to give him safe haven. The opposition is trying to challenge that in court because there, again, is a law in place to hand over any alleged war criminals that have warrants out against their name for their arrest. So that will become an issue in South Africa over whether or not to do anything about that. But outside of South Africa, depending on how that resolves, it is just China maybe and definitely Belarus. Although I would be surprised if we see Lukashenko go somewhere to escape it as well, because they could also be caught up here. It depends on what happens, because Lukashenko without Putin is nothing.
Apparently, also Lukashenko fleeing with some reports, or at least on a plane. That was a few hours ago. Not had many developments since then, but still.
Unless we can get verification for that, I'm not going to lean towards saying that he has escaped, because it is too early.
I don't think escape, but certainly there's some movement with his plane, at least, which is not nothing.
Maybe getting it ready to escape, but again, it's Lukashenko. You know, if it gets to the point for him if he has to leave for his own safety, there's no way he's getting back in. He is unpopular. He is, again, he's like Putin, except he's even a bit more of a dictator in terms of, there have been conflicts of border wars between Poland and Belarus recently, immigration issues there, of course, as well. Also between Belarus and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, although not the last one. So he's definitely surrounded by enemies, with the exception of Putin. If Putin goes, Lukashenko goes, and even if he flees, he's not getting back in. And I can't think of any countries that would give him refuge. I don't think he's even going to get refuge there. From South Africa, definitely wouldn't give him refuge. And I don't think he'd get anything from China either. He's got nowhere to go unless he wants to try and colonize the moon. I don't see anywhere for Lukashenko to go except into Russia and hide out with Putin.
And as we discussed before, Russia's a huge country geographically. So theoretically, as we discussed, Russia's had that, I guess you could almost call it policy previously, but they'd move up land they'd lose land deliberately to get more organised, and they maybe not have put in such a big fight. But if push comes to shove with Wagner and Moscow, I mean, that's not exactly impossible for Putin to move out, but he's not about to go internationally, as we said. He doesn't have many allies.
Apart from the element of surprise, the other big thing is equipment. Now, there are reports that Russians are using T-54s, T-55s behind the lines for reserve roles. T-54s were designed in 1945. These tanks are 80 years old at this point. Almost 80 years old. So they're being used for activities behind the front lines. The Russians are still rushing all of their high quality tanks, T-72s, T-80s, and etc., to the front line, but all of these rear guard duties are being carried out by much, much older Cold War era tanks, looking early Cold War, 50s, 60s. These are tanks that are being brought out of museums, from what we've heard. It's hard to get anything to verify these, but there have been photographs of these tanks being used by the Russians, and obviously the National Guard will probably have modern tanks because it is Putin's personal army, but a lot of these reserve groups that are in the area would likely be
what would those
What
would those riot police look like, though, in the National Guard that Russia's supposedly got in Moscow? Because they're not putting their military forces in Moscow. It's just, riot police versus Wagner. It's an interesting battle if it gets to that stage.
Definitely, the problem for the Wagner group is that they've been fighting a war for over a year. They do have that fatigue, but again, they do have some of the better tanks that are available to the Russians. The riot police will probably have some armored fighting vehicles. You're looking at your Russian equivalent of the Humvee. So definitely some armored vehicles. I don't think they're going to have too many tanks. National Guard will probably be pretty well equipped because, again, it enters directly to Putin. It's his personal army. So it's going to be National Guard against the Wagner group with the riot police,
and
probably being used for crowd control.
And could it be possible, again, kind of worst case scenario for the Russians, that Wagner kind of almost steamrolls through whatever protections are on the outskirts of Moscow, the city limits, and just gets straight to the city center area, and Moscow might not be prepared if they've only got riot police and National Guard there. They might not be prepared. Again, that's depending on how things go at the border checkpoint if Wagner makes it that far.
Agreed, although we've got to remember that we're coming at this from an Australian context. Moscow is, I believe, 12 million people within the city. It that's like gonna be twice as more than twice as big as Sydney. So, in fact, even the Greater Sydney area, it'd be twice as big as that. So, in terms of population, there is a lot of fighting. And it's not going to be we take it in one day. It'll probably take several days to take the city. I say that about 24 hours. I should probably clarify that and say 24 hours to get a beachhead or get some neighborhoods. If they can't even get into the outskirts, they're done for. It will be either they rush into the middle really quickly because they get there earlier than we were expecting them to, they are expected to be at Moscow sometime soon. We don't know how soon they're going to reach there, but from what we've heard, we were looking at potentially around 7 or 8 p.m. our time tonight. So it depends on how prepared the Russians are. If they can't get in quickly and get it over and done with really fast, the coup attempt will become a civil war. And if they can't even hold the outskirts of Moscow, then they can't do anything because the longer the civil war takes, the better it becomes for the Russians because they can bring more troops in. It is a massive country. They will have to bring their
Yeah,
troops in very like,
Wagner really doesn't have any more troops than those who are already on their way. I mean, unless they're relying on, Russian soldiers to flip, which is a big thing to rely on, which is a big gamble to take. Russia outnumbers them by a long shot.
we of course have been hearing about the 25,000 figure. Wagner Group is bigger than that. I believe estimates from last year had them at around 50,000, but a lot of those troops are still in Ukraine. So there could be a second wave, but the other half of the Wagner Group is already engaged with Ukrainian forces. So it's going to be
Second
hard to
wave. Gee,
extricate those.
we're continuing with that COVID terminology there.
And you're not wrong, but it will be hard to extricate those forces because they're on the front lines fighting the Ukrainians. So, because as we said last time, the Russian government there does have the advantage, and both sides want to keep fighting against the Ukrainians. And of course, yes, the Wagner Group does have a lot of soldiers, but at least this is coming again from last year's figures from the U.S. National Security Council, where they said they had about 50,000 soldiers. A lot of those are recruited prisoners. So a lot of the Wagner Group are Russian prisoners who've been conscripted into the mercenary organization as an alternative to being in prison. So where their loyalties lie, it's unclear. On one hand, Wagner Group is paying them money, and they are also probably angry they got locked up in the first place by the Russian government. On the other hand, it's Putin, KGB. So if they fight with the rest of the Wagner Group against Russia, there could be consequences for their family. So we do have to take into account that they're not robots. These soldiers are all individual people with their own individual motives and feelings. And the contractors that work for the Wagner Group are more likely to be motivated than the conscripts and the prisoners that are fighting for the Wagner Group as well. So we've got to account for that as well, and that's much harder to account for because it's 50,000 people who are all individual human beings. They're not slaves. They're nothing like that. They are individual people. So we can't predict how they will act.
And just some breaking news, by the way, Stuart. I was just going to say some breaking news.
Sure.
Wagner vehicles have reportedly been bombed by Russian air forces on that very strategic M4 highway. That is the one that leads to Moscow. They were reportedly conducting strikes, the Russian air forces, in the past half an hour or so, that Wagner vehicles reportedly bombed again on that very strategic highway. That is what leads to Moscow, and if Russian officials manage to stop them there, that stops kind of the border area, obviously. But they're taking the threat pretty seriously at this point. They're not just setting up checkpoints or enacting, just letting people go inside, the public events being cancelled, shelter-in-place orders. They are now taking this action, we have reportedly heard.
If they've reached the M4, if they're on the M4, then that's definitely going to be big because the M4 goes right through Vorosnev. Of course, it does continue down towards Rostov, but it does branch off a bit down there as well. I'm just looking at it on Google Maps right now, and it is the most direct route. The cut that we know of in the highway is on the northern side of Vorosnev, so that does leave that city vulnerable to Wagner forces. It would be interesting to know exactly where they are in terms of being whether or not they've passed Vorosnev already. I expect that they would have, um, but we just don't know. But either way, that's to get another big supply base. The two of Russia's biggest supply bases in the area are Rostov on Don and Vorosnev. There are a couple others in there. Kursk comes to mind for me as well. That's a little bit to the west of Vorosnev. Uh, Interestingly, it was a site of some of the biggest tank battles in World War II, so it's seen its days of war. That city has, but definitely in terms of if they've gone beyond Vorosnev, it does give them some more supplies that they can take advantage of. Potentially some more tanks as well. They could probably upgrade some of their older ones potentially, but that would take time. So it depends on what they want to, whether they want to get there faster or whether they want to get there with better vehicles. We just don't know. It's all speculation.
As is most of this, but at the same time, we are relying on speculation because it's either coming from state affiliated media or it's coming from Wagner affiliated media, and so we're having to be very careful relying on either, and relying is putting it one way. I'll just put up on screen now just so you can get a better picture of what Stuart was talking about. This is the M4 highway. This is from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow, exactly, and you can just see how long it is. And so it appears they're about halfway there from some unconfirmed reports, but that is how it stands. So it's quite a long journey, but we're hearing they were at 1.6 hours away, so already at that halfway point. And that's leading directly to Moscow. So if again Russian Air Force is already moving in, that's saying something, isn't it?
The other thing we have to consider as well is that we are talking about tanks, not cars. The T-80, which is one of Russia's it's a Russian main battle tank. It dates back to the Cold War, but it's one that has seen a lot of service. It's kind of a bit like the Abrams, but not really. It's a bit more old. It's a bit older than the Abrams, I'm pretty sure. And its top speed is, from memory, around only 80 kilometers per hour. So we are looking at tanks with different speeds, but are slower than cars that we would use ordinarily. So we do have to take that into account. So it's probably more like 14 hours by the time you take into account the fact that you've got armored convoys and stuff like that. So it does give Moscow a couple more hours to prepare. And it does also depend on whether or not they can get enough oil on the way. If they can be held up at, say they haven't reached Vorosnev yet, if they can be held up there or at any other city, it does give Russia a chance to use its long established approach to destroy resources while you retreat. So if they are able to blow up enough oil reserves, petrol stations, they could even deny oil to the marching Wagner forces. So there's always potential that they could be held up before they even get to Moscow if they are delayed enough. Because these tanks, their range is obviously dependent on that oil, and they do use a lot of it as well. So
Yeah, that's another very true possibility, and yeah, they obviously you've got Wagner mercenary group versus the official Russian forces, and then take into account not just the official Russian forces, but now of course the Russian National Guard's getting involved, and riot police, and I'm sure general local authorities as well. Again, if you're just joining us, that is what you're seeing on screen now. That is Rostov on Don to Moscow. 12 hours by car. I checked Google Maps. They don't have a by tank option, unfortunately. So that's the best estimate you can get. But still, you can paint a picture, and they're reportedly about halfway there is some of what we've heard. It takes 9 days to walk, by the way. There's no data for by plane or cycling, and it's 16 hours by train. It is closed, by the way, according to Google Maps, and it does have tolls. So there's your fun facts about Russia's strategic M4 highway. Very interesting to see what is going on here. And again, Putin, what he was saying about an hour and a half ago, is that he is ordering those responsible for this coup attempt to be neutralized. And as we discussed before, you can really only take that one way. But it's certainly he's coming down strong on this at this point. He's called it treason. What we're facing now is treason. What he sent, all relevant is what he said. Quote, all relevant orders have been given to the Russian military, end quote. Stuart, again, speculating, but apart from the neutralizing thing, are there any other relevant orders that might be in play here that he might have been kind of referring to, or is that something that we can, we've got really no idea what he'd be talking about?
Yeah, a lot of it would just be speculation, and of course, a lot of this is speculation. But it's varying degrees. It depends on how many facts you have to go off of. Of course, we can speculate about some things with certain like we know there's a few options, we can pick an option, but with something like this, we don't know. There are too many options to even narrow it down to a couple. The only thing I can say with some degree of certainty is, given the scorched earth tactic I mentioned earlier, I don't expect many pitched battles on the M4. If there were any, it'd be by time to destroy oil reserves. But apart from that, there's not much incentive there to do any delaying battles, because Russian military doctrine isn't really based on doing something like that.
Sources within the Wagner group telling some that Putin has made the wrong choice and Russia will soon have a new president. Which is, it's all talk. It might be all talk, but that's still pretty strong language. As we were talking about a few hours ago, but let's just go back to them. They're even more, if there was a Wagner government, that's even more militaristic than the existing government, because Putin's ex-KGBs, we've been mentioning constantly, but these are still, nationalists. These aren't like the pro-democracy opposition or anything like that. Not in the slightest, really.
Exactly. These are people who are still quite militaristic. I will say that Prigozhin, who is the leader of the Wagner group, does not have that many ties towards the Soviet Union. Notably, I believe, and this is going to test my memory, but I believe from when I was reading earlier that he is of Jewish descent, and the Jews weren't obviously liked by a lot of the Soviet Union. Similar semantics or anti-Semitism as in Nazi Germany, especially under Stalin's reign, but he doesn't have the same ties to the KGB or to the Soviet Union that Putin and his inner circle have. So it is a slightly different dynamic there. We do, of course, know that Putin isn't the only one with charges against his name. Wagner, I believe, is up for war crimes as well, or at least some sort.
And then his own arrest warrant by Russia earlier today as well. So it's really piling on the charges for him there.
Not just Russia.
Yeah.
I believe the FBI has a warrant against him as well. So it's not just Russia.
Yeah. The interesting thing, of course, is the Wagner leader, and you see what he's like, and you see, if we can just actually bring that up on screen, there he is. You can kind of see what he's like. He I don't know if he looks like someone you trust with the nuclear codes, is what someone's commented. And the button. And, you've seen there's been videos previously where he's kind of ranted and raved. And Putin, whether you like him or not, of course, plenty of people don't like him for many reasons, but he's, Putin's not a ranter and raver, and he's ex-KGB, meaning he can't be stupid, so can anyone really, can anyone else really take the leadership over? Can the Wagner leader actually lead this country, lead Russia, if that went to that extreme level?
I want to go complete speculation here and say, what happens if he teams up with Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader? If he recognizes that he can't lead, he could team up with the probably the recognized leader of the democratic parties of Russia, Alexei Navalny, who's currently in prison for, among other things, running against Putin in supposedly open elections. So some sort of alliance there would be hard to pull off, but if it could, that would definitely be to Prigozhin's advantage. And would kind of alleviate some concerns if an international community. Again, FBI charges against Prigozhin. It's going to be very hard for Western governments to work with him. If they want to get Western support, that means that they do need to bring in some of these democratic leaders. Alexei Navalny is recognized by many as the as the de facto leader of the democratic movement in Russia. Working with him or having a third party step in that is more democratic is where Western ties are going to go towards. And that Western support is going to be essential if, for some reason, Alexei Navalny gets involved either as a third party or with Prigozhin. That's how you get NATO support in terms of weapons and equipment, but that's going to be incredibly unlikely.
Yeah, I can't really imagine them teaming up because, again, he's still a nationalist. He's more militaristic, apparently. That'd be the most unlikely relationship possible. But at the same time, do you think it's possible that without even having some kind of proper alliance, that the democratic groups there can capitalize on it? If, again, Putin was ousted, they could try to capitalize on it without just going from Putin to Wagner?
If it reaches civil war, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, you do have Chechnya and the other Caucasus autonomous regions who have tried to fight for independence. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia succeeded in the August coup in 1991. They managed to get independence then. The other autonomous regions were unable to. They have fought for it since then and lost. But with Rostov-on-Don controlled by the Wagner Group, if civil war does break out, that does make it harder for Russian forces to reach the Caucasus regions. And that means we could see some autonomous regions trying to reassert their independence. We could see democratic groups come into play here. There's definitely an option, but that depends on it becoming a civil war rather than a coup. And that is going to be a lot harder to pull off.
Yeah, a civil war, obviously, it is extreme talk, but no one can really rule it out at this stage, especially given what's apparently going on the M4. I'll just bring it up again on screen for you. This is what the M4 looks like if you're looking from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow. They're about halfway there, the Wagner troops, according to some local reports, and Russian Air Forces are reportedly striking them and taking them out at the same time. 3 Russian military helicopters separately have also reportedly been downed by Wagner, is what we have heard. In terms of the international response, Foreign Minister Penny Wong's office says no comment at this stage. Just again, what was the UK Defence Ministry saying, Stuart? They've pretty much come out strongly.
They said it's the biggest challenge to the Russian regime yet of Putin.
Yeah, definitely coming out strongly there. US haven't said anything yet, but as we discussed before, so let's just go over it again, they would have a fair bit of play. Not only the fact that this is kind of leaving the Ukraine situation a bit open, if Russian and Wagner troops are leaving that, potentially, and obviously US has been a huge backer of Ukraine, but I think you also mentioned, if we really want to talk about it, Snowden.
I mean, it's definitely It's going to depend on who gets involved in that. If democratic forces do come into play, we could see him being turned over. That is a lot harder, but it is one of those questions we're going to have to ask, and that's talking about your international consequences of the civil war or the coup attempt. It's not an isolated bubble of Russia and Ukraine. There are other factors. For example, about 40 minutes ago, the Polish president said that he is watching, and he's got intelligence sources watching Moscow to see what happens. He's reportedly been talking with the Polish defense minister and deputy prime minister. So the Polish president is talking with his government about what to do. They are watching this closely. Again, they are bordering Belarus. So if Lukashenko gets involved in this, we can expect something from Poland. We know that Poland and Belarus don't like each other. There, of course, have been border skirmishes in the last year or so. So anything happening there is going to be important. So these nations that are bordering the countries involved are watching closely. And I expect when the Americans wake up, they're probably already be. I wouldn't be surprised if Joe Biden's already being briefed about this, that we are going to see a similar stance from the US, from Germany, and from France. I haven't heard anything yet from Germany or France, the other major powers in the EU and in NATO. We haven't heard anything from either of them yet, but with Britain and Poland watching and waiting, I expect we're going to see similar stances from everyone else. The next 24 hours are going to be crucial. It comes down to, can the Wagner group get any control in Moscow? That's the do or die question, is can they get into Moscow?
And do you think they can, that they actually have a realistic shot there, again, taking into account the differencing force types and just the equipment?
I could say it's definitely possible. That's I know that's very, very, very vague. I am inclined not to make guesses because you and I have a history of guessing completely wrong. Um, when it
Yes,
comes to
yes.
things like
You should
this,
never
I
listen to
don't
us
want to
for
jinx
advice on
this.
this.
Listen to our analysis, but don't take our advice. Yeah, I definitely believe. I want to say a very real possibility. It's looking. If I had to give you exact figures, I'm going to say 40% chance that they can get into Moscow. If you want me to give you an exact number, I'd say 40% chance they can get into Moscow.
It's going to be
But
interesting. Yeah,
I
it's going to be
doubt.
interesting to see how that plays out. Let's bring in now, just quickly, Stuart, National Affairs Editor Austin Pollock. Austin, what have you got for us right now regarding these latest developments? Because social media remains abuzz.
Yeah, Leo, we're seeing right across social media, right across the internet. The internet is breaking with all these major stories that are coming out of Russia this evening and this morning, their time. And we've heard from multiple foreign entities, including France's Emmanuel Macron. They're saying they are closely watching the situation in Russia. And they remain focused on supporting Ukraine even now. And Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman rather, has called on Russians to rally around Putin. Which is quite an interesting statement, because obviously, you know, he's only really liked by people in that country, obviously, and some around the world, but not as many as I'm sure he would like. But they, after what he called an armed mutiny by the Wagner mercenary group. Now, she has said, oh yeah, to rally around him, which it's quite interesting, and we will continue to monitor the latest developments, as the UK is also as well. They're continuing to also monitor that. But as the day rises on Moscow, certainly a lot more developments to come as we hear of the Wagner group proceeding to Moscow as well.
Stuart, let's bring you back in. You said that Putin is briefing Lukashenko now.
Yes, that's come out in just the last 20 minutes or so. You and I were talking earlier about whether or not Lukashenko will flee. It's now been confirmed from the Belarusian presidency's Telegram channel that Putin has briefed Lukashenko and has once again vowed to crush it, but he is keeping the Belarusian government informed about what is happening. We don't know much more than that. Again, this has come from the Belarusian government itself, though. We do know that Lukashenko is now in the loop.
Right, yeah, so that'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Do you reckon, Stuart, he'd be briefing any other of those allies or even just people who don't fully hate him at this point, as we discussed earlier, names like China and India, and that's about it?
Probably. They're not his priority, though. I think the fact that he's briefed Lukashenko means there's a chance it won't fail instantly. The fact that he even thinks it's necessary to talk to Lukashenko means the Russian government thinks there's even a very, very slim chance that it could become violent. But it does mean that either they're not wanting to hedge their bets, or they're at least they recognize that there's some small chance that something happens. It is an authoritarian regime. Dissenting is not a popular pastime for the Russian government, but there is always an opportunity there. Putin has reportedly actually flown. There's talks that he could even fly to Lukashenko. That hasn't been confirmed. I'm just seeing that now on social media. I have no other verification for that. Potential talks of flights between Minsk and Moscow, but no confirmation on that. But just put it out there as well. Although again, no confirmation on that. I have seen talks of it, but I don't have any verification for that. Nothing from any government is saying it.
Right, yeah, and again, Russian fighter jet we've just heard may have gone down. That's adding on to those 3 military helicopters that have reportedly gone down. Austin, you got anything in that regard?
Yeah, so just footage here, which we'll try and get up on screen within the next few minutes. There's video showing a Russian fighter jet going down over the Voronezh region. Again, I don't speak Russian, but it's over a region. It's definitely a Russian fighter jet. Again, somewhat unconfirmed, but definitely it is going quite viral on social media right now across multiple news outlets, and it does seem to be quite a verified source. But obviously, if that is the case, that is a major development that they have now managed to take down air support from the Russian military. Now, that's got to be major.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
you go ahead, Stuart.
did you say Vorosnev that they've reached?
Correct.
That's your halfway. That's your halfway mark.
Correct.
That seems to, we know that they don't have much of an air force. Well, that the Wagner group doesn't have much of an air force. So if they're able to take down Russian jets, it means they're probably physically there, and that means that chances are we're going to see reports in the next hour or two that Vorosnev has also fallen, or that it's repelled the invaders. But more likely that Vorosnev has fallen to Wagner group if they were able to take down fighter jets in that area.
This was just within the last 10 minutes, so.
Right, so that's interesting that it's just coming in there, and we'll continue to follow that. You've just got it on screen now. That is from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow, the M4 highway, this very strategic M4 highway, and you can kind of imagine and visualize unofficially, and I won't attempt to pronounce anything, about halfway point. So that's not insignificant. That is not insignificant. And if Wagner continues to move forward, I mean, this could be a really big development. Again, just depending on how things go there. But that's looking like it'll be a close one to follow, and a really important thing to follow in that regard. For those of you just joining us, Foreign Minister Penny Wong's office has responded to 6 News when we asked them if she's got any statement about this. No comment at this stage. We have also reached out to DFAT for anything. The UK Defence Ministry is already putting out strong statement. Sorry, just against to it. It doesn't appear anything from the US though officially. I know they're kind of waking up on Saturday morning for them, but nothing yet.
I could have missed it, as I missed the French one because I was talking with you.
Although, in fairness, US one, usually we all get 20 notifications from CNN and Fox and BBC about it. So,
I mean, you're not wrong. You're definitely not wrong, but I have not seen anything as of yet. but it's definitely going to be one to watch for because it will happen.
It seems inevitable, yeah, and well, if Putin's already spoken, it's not going to be long till he speaks. Not he, I mean, excuse me. If anyone in the US speaks in regards to this, whether that be Secretary of State or the White House press secretary or someone, I wouldn't expect an address from Joe Biden about this.
I have some more details
No,
for
go
you. I have some more details about that fighter jet that we have that has reportedly been shot down. It is not in the city of Rostov. It's only in the broader oblast, the region. It is not far away from the border of Ukraine. So that means it may not be shot down by the Wagner group. It could be taken out by the Ukrainian government. We don't have any more details, but it may not be the Wagner group behind it. But it is reportedly being shot down just over the border from what I am seeing. So there is a chance that it may not be taken out by the Wagner group. I'm not going to say either way, but we have to keep that in mind that although there is an attempted coup going on, there is still a war with Ukraine.
Right, yeah, that'll be interesting to establish what's going on there. But it does remain interesting, and look, we stress everything is unverified here, and we're trying to do our best to confirm independently for you. But as you can imagine, it can be hard when one of the sources is a Wagner affiliated Telegram group and the other is Russian state media. We're doing our best here. But again, as we also heard, 3 military helicopters shot down is what we've heard in regards to this Russia fighter jet. We'll have to wait and see. Wagner forces also reportedly hit, which has been interesting. So yeah, we'll continue to follow those developments. Wagner groups, by the way, but the Wagner groups billboards, I should say, in Moscow, being torn down, which is change of pace to what's happened previously. Look, stay with us. Stuart and Austin will be back after this short break. But in the meantime, we're going to take a look at some of the other top stories making news today as we continue to follow this major breaking news again. If you are just joining us, a coup attempt in Russia and ongoing fighting between the Wagner Group and Russian forces. Stay with us. You're watching 6 News Live. It's just gone 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.
Good evening. These are the headlines on 6 News this hour, and first to breaking news. And the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group has said his forces will go all the way and says his army is ready to die as an apparently military coup is staged. Here is what we know right now. The boss of Russian mercenary group Wagner, Yevhen Prigozhin, claims his troops have marched into Russia from Ukraine. He has been accused of calling for an armed mutiny, and Russia has issued an arrest warrant. He has previously clashed with the Russian defense minister over problems on the battlefield also. The Kremlin says Vladimir Putin is receiving constant updates on the situation, with all public events in Moscow cancelled and a counter-terrorism response enacted. The Wagner chief says he has control of all military sites in Rostov-on-Don, and he has demanded to speak with Russian military officials. He claims his troops have shot down a second Russian military helicopter. That unverified footage is on your screen at the moment, and he says he will take his force all the way to Moscow. The major highway, the M4, which connects Moscow to southern regions including Rostov and near the main city Rostov-on-Don, has been closed, with footage showing armed vehicles travelling on it. The Russian army says it will guarantee the safety of Wagner fighters who stop rebelling. 6 News GovCheck editor Stuart Jeffrey says he doubts whether we'll know soon of a successful coup.
I doubt that it'll be resolved quickly, unless they manage to somehow capture Putin or knock out Putin. I doubt that he'll surrender. So Putin won't give up power easily. It will be a fight unless they can somehow get Putin himself, or whether that means assassinate him or capture him. Unless they can do that, which will also be hard to do. It will be a slog, probably.
Also making news this hour, sanctions have been placed against people involved in the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, which killed 298 people, 38 Australians, while flying over Ukraine in 2014. The Australian government imposing travel bans as well as financial sanctions. And a new report has found that United States intelligence found no direct evidence of COVID-19 starting in a Wuhan lab. Republicans have, although, accused the Biden administration of withholding information, as the report cites intelligence officials were unable to determine the origins of COVID-19. Tomorrow's weather, and fine and sunny for Brisbane, top of 27 degrees, Sydney also sunny, 20, Canberra sunny, 12, Melbourne 14 and showers, Hobart 14 partly cloudy, Adelaide 15 and showers, Perth 16 degrees partly sunny, and Darwin it will be 32 and mostly sunny. Alright, and those are the latest headlines up to the minute here on 6 News. There's more news on our website, sixnewsau.com, and on social media you can find the latest by searching 6newsau to find us. More news coverage continues right after this. For now though folks, I'm Austin Pollock. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you soon.
And you're back with us here on 6 News as we continue our coverage of the unfolding situation in Russia with that reported coup attempt and Vladimir Putin ordering those responsible to be quote-unquote neutralized. And you can kind of imagine what exactly that entails, calling it treason. Pretty extraordinary, and we're continuing our coverage with our team, GovCheck editor and the host of Between Parks Place, Stuart Jeffrey, and our National Affairs editor, Austin Pollock. Stuart, a lot going on, and we heard those reports about a Russian fighter jet being shot down. No idea who's responsible for that yet, if it is indeed true. But still, there is conflict with Wagner forces being hit by Russian air forces. We know that. We also know that at least 3 military helicopters on the Russian side have been downed in the past couple of hours.
Absolutely. We haven't heard much more about conflict between the Wagner forces and the Russian forces yet, but the closer they get to Moscow, the more likely that is. Of course, I personally am not inclined to think we're going to see much conflict until they reach Moscow itself, but that's always a possibility that we could see conflict before then. At any point, we are about 6 hours away, roughly, from the main column of Wagner Group forces reaching Moscow. That is the reports we're hearing. However, we do not know how far out the lead or reconnaissance elements are of that force. I wouldn't say any sooner than at least 4 hours until the lead elements reach Moscow.
And the reports that we're also hearing is that Russian forces have closed one of the bridges outside of Moscow. So that's happening. Russia's armed forces in the Voronezh region are carrying out operational and combat activity. So certainly there is fighting, is what we know, between them. Now, it's not just Wagner moving in and taking control. There is a conflict now going on.
Definitely, they have been declared terrorists by Putin himself. So definitely, we're seeing the riot police and the National Guard in Moscow being mobilized, preparing for that Wagner Group arrival. And we do know that that is their next target. And it's all going to come down to the next 24 hours whether Wagner Group can get control of any part of Moscow, a city of around 12 million people.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to see this. Let's bring in again Austin Pollock, National Affairs editor. Austin, again, it appears again as we're just repeating the same line, but we should stress that they are about halfway to Moscow, Wagner forces. And that's where this conflict this has kind of spruiked up in the past few minutes. You're seeing it on the map now from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow. It's about 12 hours, 14 hours really with a tank. But we do know there is fighting now. But yet Wagner is approaching.
Yeah, Leo, and once they get to Moscow, it'll be a major. Well, as it looks like they're already anticipating it. Like I think they've shut down all events, public events that are happening there. The mayor's said not to be roaming around if you don't have to. They're almost in anticipation now. Obviously, it will take a while for Wagner and his men to get there, but it seems it would be likely. And once they get there, it's obviously going to be very intense because we'll see, as we've seen so much, it's basically an act of terrorism in Moscow's eyes and the Kremlin's eyes. And we'll see more likely a much bigger scale operation. And as I've said, given that they are anticipating this now, it's obviously Wagner's obviously going to be met with a lot of Russian force, but they're obviously anticipating some sort of conflict once they do arrive. But that's obviously still a fair few hours away, as you said, about 12, 14 hours. So that will take a while to happen. But if it does happen, certainly it will be major.
And we will cover it here on 6 News, including overnight. I don't think anyone's getting sleep following this story. And it is one that requires following because it has just developed so fast. Less than 12 hours, really, from reports of a coup attempt to this. And it's been extraordinary to see it play out this fast. Stuart, do you think we're at a point where it might slow down? Or it could just, as I said, Wagner attempts a real steamroll here just to get into Moscow?
There's no way it's slowing down. He has committed. He has been labeled a terrorist. There's a warrant against him from the Russian government. There is no way he's backing down now.
Yeah, and it's too late to back down anyway. And the Wagner forces, who apparently, if they turn, Russia says, they'll be fine. I mean, when Putin's also talking about neutralizing those responsible. I don't know. It's you wouldn't be in a good position there, but certainly Putin he's come out with that strong language. I don't know if he's going to come out with more responses soon. The US is the next we should be hearing from soon, and eventually Australia. I'm sure Penny Wong at the Foreign Minister's office just says no comment at this stage. We've also reached out to DFAT for any potential comment, but neutralise. I mean, Austin again. That's a word that really only has a few meanings when you're talking about Putin saying it, and none of them would be good for the Wagner Group.
No, none of them will be. I mean, neutralize. It's not a word you'd use lightly, and especially if Putin's saying it. But then on the other hand, they're also saying that if they change sides, then the Russian military will look after them. So it's they'll definitely won't be greeted well wherever they're going against the Russian military. But I think Putin's just trying to scare Wagner off. It's obviously probably not going to work, but with all these threats he's making, but neutralized is a damn big word, and I'm sure he'll own up to that, and he'll definitely stand by his words, Putin.
Yeah, the Wagner Group is not going to back down here, and I mean, why would they at this point if we're talking about a potential coup?
They've gone too far to turn around, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think they're about to have the defense minister reach out to them, the Russian defense minister. I think they're not going to have that happen at this point. But I mean, it seems like, Stuart, that the Wagner Group is just going to continue to not just to move forward here, but to really ramp up their messaging as well. I mean, Wagner, I've seen some of the leader's statements before, and it was ranting and raving, and he's not a happy man in general. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say we have just had a report in from the British Foreign Ministry. This report of claiming that there is unrest across Russia outside of Voronezh and Rostov-on-Don, countrywide unrest and a threat of further turmoil throughout the entire country. Russian flights are also closing down to other countries, and the British government has advised everyone, if you're either in Russia, to get out or not to go there. This, of course, has been a policy since the war in Ukraine to not fly to Russia, but they are saying there are a lack of return flights, people flying out of Russia. The Russian government appears to be closing down its flights in preparation for this conflict, this clash that will happen in 6 to 8 hours' time in Moscow.
And the other thing, of course, is that when you've got public events shut down, I mean, Russian people obviously they're getting most of their information, I imagine, from Russian state TV. But could this kind of amplify those who are already against Putin? If then seeing that maybe a realistic coup attempt here that could help them, as we discussed before, the pro-democracy parties wanting some action, an unlikely alliance with Wagner.
Again, it is going to be unlikely. The fact that they've got unrest across Russia makes it seem to me that we could see a further public revolt. Now, of course, this public revolt would be more likely to be a pro-democracy one rather than a Wagner one. Of course, the Wagner campaign right now against the Russian government is based as an attack on Putin. They share similar policies. Again, he's a former close friend of Putin, close friend, of course, until this civil war or coup attempt, whichever it's going to turn out to be. But regardless, the alliance between a potential alliance between the democratic groups and the Wagner group would be nothing more than the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't expect
And I doubt it would be a very stable or long-lasting one either.
And the last thing we need is another Eastern European country with instability within its borders. We've seen that go poorly in Belarus. We've seen it go poorly in Poland and in other countries. Of course, Ukraine has had its own problems as well. In the middle of the last decade, about 10 years ago, there was some unrest there as well. So the Western countries are certainly going to be aware of this. And so any response from outside countries will have to be very careful and very measured, except for any outside action taken against them by Belarus, who doesn't have to worry about international pressure because, again, they rely, or by they, I mean Lukashenko relies on Putin being in power. We've always been talking about whether or not Belarus can get involved in the war in Ukraine, and this is going to be that test for Belarus. Will they get involved in, if not Ukraine, at least this war against Wagner, because everything hinges on it for that country.
Yeah, and again, you're just seeing it on screen now. The Rostov-on-Don to Moscow on that M4, very strategic, and that's where this conflict is reportedly popping up. But Austin, you'll note that this has just come, as I've stressed so much, but it has come so fast from them starting to move into Rostov-on-Don to talking about them being in Moscow within hours. I mean, it's extraordinary, and as we discussed with Stuart before, they're probably not going to stop anytime soon. This is going to be full steam ahead.
Yeah, you're right. And the first tweet I saw, the first thing I heard of it was about at 7 o'clock Brisbane time this morning. And I had a look in there and I saw all these tanks rolling down a Russian street. And then that's what's happened now. This has just progressed into this. It's excuse me, throughout the course of the day, it's gone so fast, and it's likely to continue to. It's only going to get faster, really. I mean, judging by Wagner Group's stance on this, it's only going to intensify, and obviously, as we've said, it's a few hours away, as you've got on your screen at the moment, a few hours away from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow, but likely they will speed up this coup attempt, and but it has absolutely gone very fast, and within the last 12 hours, this is intensified to this. Now we're seeing Vladimir Putin ordering, once allies to be neutralized.
Stuart, do we know anything about, I know we don't know everything here, but just about Wagner in general, the group itself, in terms of how closely or maybe not closely they've been working with Russia's official forces, again, because it's the tension between the Wagner leader and the Russian Defense Ministry is not a new one. It's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, of course, they were close during the last decade or so. We, of course, know that the Wagner Group was quite involved in the Libyan conflict around 2014 or so, and, of course, was also involved in Syria, where the Russian government was backing the Syrian Assad regime, fighting against ISIS and democratic rebels that were backed by the US, as well as remnants of Al-Qaeda in the area. So there is a long history there between the Russian government and the Ministry of Defense. but the Wagner Group, which has basically turned into a private military and security company, which is indicative of a broader military industrial complex in Russia. The fact that we now have a private military and security company operating independently of Russia, because of course they are now, the US estimates, around 50,000 strong, 10,000 contractors, and around 40,000 prisoners. Those prisoner figures are doubted by other outlets, but regardless, there is a sizable number, at least 20,000 from what I am seeing. And of course, this is now creating conflict because the mercenary group can now operate independently of Moscow, and that is causing some conflict because they still entirely use Russian equipment, yet they are not beholden to follow every single order that comes from Moscow to the Wagner group. So that is going to inevitably form some sort of conflict. We have seen paramilitary groups, of course, in Ukraine, in those two obelisks that are asserting independence from Ukraine, with Russian backing. Of course, the paramilitary groups, they're mostly nationalist groups. There aren't many left-wing groups in the area, and these paramilitary groups follow most orders from Moscow because they are smaller. The Wagner Group, which is more established, being a private military company, mercenary group, rather than being a paramilitary organization, means it has a more separate command structure and is less integrated with the Russian defense forces.
Keep those comments coming in. For those of you watching live on YouTube, you can support our coverage, by the way, for just $4 a month, patreon.com/sixnewsau. Love to get your thoughts on this, Stuart. Something that someone brought up, the Russian rebels, especially someone who might be like not Wagner affiliated, but they're already kind of wanting to rebel against the Russian military. They might join the Wagner group formally in this coup attempt. Do you reckon that's a possibility? I know we talked before about they're all individuals, but we know there has been some resistance on the front line and not just from Wagner.
Well, the one thing we do know, of course, is that the Russian military has brought out museum tanks. Not necessarily tanks from museums themselves, but old, early Cold War era tanks, T-54s. We have not yet seen any of the IS-KV line or the T-34 line. These, of course, were the mainstays during World War II, but there are some of those also in storage. They have not yet resorted to using those, but we do know that there are T-60s and T-54s being used behind Russian lines, especially in Ukraine for occupation roles. Of course, because the Russian government is using up its tanks against the Ukrainian weapons, and of course the Ukrainians who are armed with Western modern anti-tank weaponry are seeing much more success as the tanks get older and older. Their armor decreases. T-54s are pretty vulnerable to missile strikes hitting the top of their armor, where it is quite thin, compared to the roughly 120 millimeters, I believe, on the front. The hull is a bit weaker, and so of course you're going to be having older tanks with older armor, and of course the equipment inside these vehicles, the radios, are of course going to be older as well, and more prone to the side effect of being 80 years old in some instances, and so are in a state of disrepair. But the other thing we've got to remember here as well is that means that Russian military bases within Siberia, within the Ural Mountains, and even just to the west of the Ural Mountains, east of Moscow, a lot of those military bases that are there do have older tanks. And of course, that means that civilian groups can more easily arm themselves because these tanks and these infantry stations are much easier to take out because they're using older weapons. So, of course, that kind of evens the playing field a bit for these civilian groups, for the democratic organizations, and they can get some weapons on their own without having to rely on NATO or China or some other group providing them. So that does give them opportunity to try and assert their own dominance, which will be interesting to see if we have any third parties. Of course, my money is on the left-wing democratic parties coming out and forming some sort of organization against the Russian government and against the Wagner group. We could see a three-way civil war. We could see even more factions like we saw in Syria, like we saw in Iraq to an extent, and like we saw in Gaddafi's Libya, where there were more than just the three factions, of course. We don't know how many different factions there will be. I've mentioned earlier about the autonomous regions in the Caucasus, so we don't know how that will turn out, but it's definitely likely that we could see some third-party rebels coming into play here.
Right, yeah. Austin, it's interesting because we talk about civil war and we stress that's kind of the most extreme case scenario here, maybe even more extreme than Putin being removed. But Putin's been there, again, it's hard to imagine post-Soviet Russia without Putin involved in it as prime minister or president or, as the man controlling a puppet even. And so it would be extraordinary for him to go, especially given that we cannot forget, they're still currently in the middle of a war with Ukraine. It's going from Ukraine versus Russia to Ukraine. Let me rephrase that. It's going from Ukraine versus Russia to Russia versus Russia at this point.
Yeah, and this has all been under Putin's control. He's been there for 22 and a half years in some shape or form. But, Putin, he's not the sort of guy who would back down. And this is, I'm actually reading something here right now on Al Jazeera. A independent military analyst has said that this is probably the worst crisis of Putin's leadership. And he's taken away what this whole program was supposed to do. Was supposed to be Russia versus Ukraine. And now, under his management, he's now made it Russia versus Russia, and he's facing the prospect of Moscow being attacked by the Wagner group, which obviously would be a massive crisis for his 22-and-a-half-year term.
Yeah, and there was no indication he was going anywhere. I mean, this war was one thing, but at some points people were talking about, Russia's getting ahead with this. But now Ukraine is able to start, Ukraine to just sneakily move back into its territories while everyone's distracted by Russia versus Russia. I mean, for Ukrainian officials, for Zelensky, they would be pretty happy with this. Maybe not wanting Wagner to take control of Russia, because obviously both are still fighting Ukraine at this point, and although the Wagner leaders may be a bit less rational than Putin, but in the next few hours and days, this is Ukraine's perfect time to just come back in, because at this point, Wagner's moving out its troops, and if things get really extreme, Russia will move out its troops too.
And we've already heard CNN was reporting earlier that Ukraine, according to actually Russia's ministry, that Ukraine forces were reoccupying, I think, Bakhmut, it might have been. I might be wrong, but they were reoccupying some territory.
I think that was
moving in and taking it. Yeah, and they were taking advantage of this situation that Putin and the Russian military forces have found themselves in.
Yeah, and that's going to be one to follow there. Just looking at social media, and it's really the only story right now, and it's understandably so the only story. If this somehow did, end in the next 48 hours, and it didn't drag on for days, and I don't think it will end in the next 40 hours, but if it didn't, do you reckon, going on to what we discussed further, they're going to be a lot more cautious of potential coup attempts in Russia, and Putin might be more aware of that, and he might, again, as we discussed, really try to wipe out any dissent as a result of this?
It's the excuse he needs. I'm not saying that it was set up to give him the power. I'm not saying it was, it was set up this way to be used as a pretense. Some might say Palpatine style, for example. But definitely it will be taken advantage of by the Russian government if it fails. It will definitely be used to crack down on any and all dissent.
Yeah, and of course we can't say that it's sudden that he's been going, the Wagner leader's been going against the Russian officials. He's been ranting and raving for quite some time, but it's built up to the point where we're even talking somewhat realistically about a civil war. I mean, it would be a huge escalation, that goes without saying, but it again doesn't seem like, I'm not saying it will, but the word unlikely, or very unlikely, they're not phrases I'd use associated with the possibility of a civil war at this point. It's extreme.
Well, it's too early to call it a civil war. There hasn't even been a major armed conflict yet, so we definitely can't shift to the language of a civil war. It will
Yet.
depend.
Yet.
Yet,
Yeah.
it will depend on what happens in the next 48 hours or so as to whether or not we change our language. If it's still ongoing within the next 48 hours, we'll probably see media outlets, including ourselves, change towards using the word coup, from coup to civil war. But at this point in time, it hasn't been happening for long enough. There hasn't even been a major conflict between the two sides yet, so we can't call it a civil war because civil war implies war. So
Of course.
we haven't had that yet, apart from a few helicopters being shot down.
Speaking of war, have we actually seen any developments regarding Russia fighting Ukraine in the past 12 hours or so? Have they just totally forgotten about that to worry about Wagner?
Apparently, we've had, this is according to the Russian government, 51 cruise missiles and 2 drones also being used, self-destructive drones even. So that's what 51 objects being fired into Kiev. And according to the Russian government, 41 of those 51 cruise missiles were fired from naval vessels and also from the Air Force. So once again, these are the 2 branches of the military that Wagner can't really exert much control over. And again, these ships are based out of the Black Sea, also the Caspian Sea. But what makes the Caspian Sea interesting is that that's where Rostov on Don is. So it is a real question here: is how much longer can the Russian military or the Russian Navy go? Rostov on Don and Sevastopol are their 2 main naval bases in the region, with Rostov on Don now held by the Wagner Group forces. If Ukraine can then take advantage of their civil war to take Sevastopol, which of course is in the Crimea, which was taken by the Russian government in 2014-2015 and occupied then. If we see Sevastopol also falling, it's only in my opinion, it's only a question of time then as to how long until the Russian Navy is restricted in what it can do, especially given the fact that we now have Vorozhnev and Rostov on Don both being controlled by the Ukrainian, not by the sorry, by the Wagner Group forces. This gives an option for Ukraine to come in, but also, and I say again, it's the factor that I don't think we've seen any media outlets cover yet is: do we see more rebels in the Caucasus Mountains? We have seen a lot of that over the last 30 years. Putin has been the main opponent to these groups. We have the 2 Chechen wars, for example, even conflicts within Georgia that he has helped prop up the Georgian government there, I believe. Also, at times, propping up other groups within the Caucasus countries as they are. We could see conflict there. And of course, this is Russia, not the Soviet Union. So the fact that we've now got Kazakhstan there means it's much narrower in terms of the routes you can take to get down to the Caucasus. You mainly are relying on the M4 highway, which is that portion of that highway is now held by the Wagner Group. So that's also potential for a new hotspot of conflict there as well. So
and
we
just
are
some
having
important breaking news there, sorry Stuart, but I was just going to say in regards to the Air Force situation, because we know Wagner, it's more of just a tanks thing here. We have seen now reports that Wagner has captured a military airfield in the Voronezh region, which I think is around halfway from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow. They have tanks, they have SAMs as well, which reportedly shot down that Russian military transport plane, which has killed all soldiers on board. So Wagner reportedly did that. Again, we stress the word reportedly. I cannot say reportedly more. But it seems like on the way, Wagner might be trying to pick up some air force here, and that could really help them.
Well, SAM, of course, being your surface-to-air missiles, which is potentially what was used to shoot down the was it MH370 that went over Ukraine, or was that the other one?
MH17.
That other one, yeah. That was the one, yeah. That was the one that flew over and was probably taken out by Russian, or at least the rebels backed by Russia, using. I can't remember if that was some form of SAM, surface-to-air missile, whether that be launched from a missile launcher or from a vehicle. We don't know all the details there, but definitely the use of SAMs does kind of balance the playing field there a bit. Sure, they might have planes, but do they have any pilots? There's no point having planes if you can't fly them. So, to what extent they can use those planes, we don't know. It definitely is important. Again, Vorosnev is a major supply base. They would also have planes from Rostov, but the extent to which they can use those planes is unclear because we don't know how many pilots have changed sides.
If any. Austin, you've got something for us?
Yeah, Leo. Wagner's chief, I'm not going to say his last name, but the president is obviously responding to these claims that Vladimir Putin made earlier and that has been rolling over on their state media. He said the president is deeply mistaken. We are patriots of our motherland. No one is going to surrender because we don't want the country to continue to live in corruption, lies, and bureaucracy. So some quite bold statements made there.
And some
by
big
Wagner
breaking
chief.
news, by the way. We've just seen reports, that an oil depot, there is a fire that has erupted in an oil depot in Voronezh, in Russia, where this fighting is going on. So those reports have just come in.
That'll probably be the Russian forces taking out oil supplies to help try and starve those tanks, because again, they do have limited range. From memory, I used to be a massive tank nerd when I was younger. The T-80s have a range of around 300 kilometers. And for the earlier tanks, T-54s, that's much shorter. For T-60s, again, I think it's around 250. I could be wrong there, but the T-80s definitely around 300 kilometers. So without any oil, you can't use those tanks. That reduces them to infantry, and of course, infantry will get demolished by the riot police and National Guard, waiting for their arrival in Moscow. So this is going to be a crucial thing, and again, it's the scorched earth warfare that Russia has used time and time again against the Nazis, against Napoleon, against the Swedish in the 1800s and 1700s. We've seen it time and time again, is that they will destroy these crucial resources as they retreat and starve the enemy of the supplies they need to keep pushing. That's how every time they've managed to defend their country, famously in the winter, but that's how they survived. They destroy the resources the enemy needs to keep pushing.
But we'll get the footage up for you in a moment. But again, that goes on to what we were speculating about before that, the very strong possibility that Russia might be doing that, and really just trying anything to stop these Wagner forces getting in, because as you say, they don't have the most up-to-date equipment. It's been a really confusing situation here when we're talking about both of them fighting Ukraine, but clearly one with a leader with its own agenda, being Wagner, and who has been outspoken in his criticisms and rants against the Russian Defense Ministry and the Chief of General Staff. The Russian Defense Minister and the Chief of General Staff, the people he wanted to see. We can say that's definitely not going to happen, but again, Putin saying... Well, Putin has essentially said that the Wagner leader will be neutralized here. That's the simplest way of putting it here. And by neutralized, make a good assumption about what that might be.
Yeah, look, it is getting hard to comment on a lot of these things because we just don't know. We don't have the media outlet to tell us. I definitely say it's definitely. Again, I've said this before. I'll say there's definitely a possibility. I can't speak too firmly on all these things because we just don't have the information to answer them. But I'd say that definitely is a real possibility that we could see that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't want to have to repeat the same things. It does get a bit tedious. But still, what is going on here in terms of Putin? I mean, we discussed this a couple hours ago, Stuart. In regards to Moscow getting Wagner control, but Putin taking charge. I mean, Wagner forces are talking with language and Wagner sources are reportedly using language like new president. I mean, it does seem like a bit of a stretch, and you can forgive me for having it hard to believe, but again, that's just simply because Putin's been there for so long.
Yeah, there have been two coup attempts which have led this. Well, one coup attempt that failed in 1991, of course, the August coup that there failed, but it did lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And of course, we have the two coup attempts in the 1917 March and October, I believe that was against the Russian monarchy and then against the government that replaced the Russian monarchy, which of course led to the Russian Civil War. That of course led to further conflicts in Poland, which got independence, and in a few other countries, and that wasn't resolved really until the Second World War, when Russia was able to really take that land for good. So we could see the conflict go on for a while with those ports in the Black Sea. It is potential that the Wagner group can hold out, or that would require potentially working with either rebels in the Caucasus or with democratic organizations if they get involved. Those organizations won't do anything until there's a chance that Putin will fall, because they know that if it fails, it will be used as an excuse to crack down even further. So a lot of these people are going to wait until we know what's happening. So Wagner will be on his own for the next 48 hours, and then we could see some other groups get involved. But they're all waiting for the two sides to clash, because again, we keep talking it up, but until they clash, we do not know the fate of this coup attempt / civil war / successful coup.
There you see on your screen right now that massive fire at the oil depot where Wagner forces are reportedly at. And Stuart, as you said, that would essentially be starving the tanks at this point, because they're about halfway on the way to Moscow at that point from Rostov-on-Don. And there's the map you see. Kind of imagine where they might be from there. But yeah. So in terms of, again, just going back to Wagner, again, it seems they're more militaristic than the current Russian government. They still want to deal with Ukraine forcefully. This really wouldn't change as much as, because they're nowhere they're not a pro-democracy movement. They're just simply more fighting, and they're pissed off that they, with the choice of language, but they're pissed off that they haven't had enough support, and they've had losses on the battlefield, and they're directing that towards the Russian Defense Ministry.
Well, it's more than that. This is breaking news. As of about 5 minutes ago, Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group, has directly spoken against Putin. This is the first time he has done that. But he has said that Putin was deeply mistaken. He call him a traitor. According to Prigozhin, no one's going to turn themselves in at the request of the president. We don't want the country to continue to live in corruption and lies. We are patriots, and those who are against us are the ones who gathered around the bastards, referring to Putin. Now, of course, the question is, he's complaining about corruption and lies. How much of that is rhetoric, and how much of that is actually truth? Because the democratic groups would obviously, resonate with those claims of corruption and lies, because they've experienced it firsthand. But the question is, how much of that does he actually believe, and how much of it is just rhetoric? Because
maybe trying to get those democracy groups on side, if they all have the same boo Putin attitude, maybe they're just he's trying to work up some kind of ally there to form a government. Again, if you're really talking if it's successful or not.
And the risk there is returning to 1917. That was pro-democracy groups and socialists and workers' rights groups and parts of the military all turned on the Russian monarchy, who was deposed. They then tried to form a more democratic government.
As you say, enemy of my enemy.
Yeah, they tried to form a more democratic government to replace the monarchy, and then the communists, who had originally worked with the Democrats to take control of Russia, then flipped on them. So last time there was a civil war, we saw people flip sides, and they're going to be aware of that here. They're watching and waiting to see what happens. Everyone's watching and waiting. We won't see anything until we see a clash between Putin and Prigozhin's Wagner group.
Yeah, and I've just changed the map, by the way, you're seeing on screen now. So that is from, I hate pronunciations. Voronezh to Moscow. So again, that's halfway from Rostov-on-Don, roughly. Give or take a few hours, given it's tanks, not cars we're talking about here. And this is just a Google Maps estimate. Traffic's probably a little bad, but it does paint a picture of how far they've moved. Again, Russia is geographically a massive country, that cannot be understated. So, what's going to happen there? If they're going to move further than that, will be interesting. If the Wagner forces are able to move out further. What's interesting is, and you mentioned it, Stuart, that the Wagner leader is directly going against Putin now, because apparently what we were hearing very initially was it was more against the Russian Defense Minister and Chief of General Staff, but now it is against Putin specifically, which is that kind of coup language at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely turned to an anti-Putin rhetoric. Although, again, that was calling Putin mistaken. He did not say Putin is corrupt. He said Putin was deeply mistaken, to call him a traitor and treasonous. We have not seen him yet say that Putin is corrupt, that Putin is lying. It's that the defense ministry is lying, the government is corrupt, and Putin is deeply mistaken. We need to now take that treason language and apply it to Putin, or apply some of that to Putin, and then he's speaking against Putin. Right now, Putin is just deeply mistaken.
And we've also seen some reports that there's lots of police outside the Wagner offices in Moscow, and also something in St. Petersburg as well regarding Wagner, which sounds like Moscow is cracking down on them as much as they can without direct military action, just shutting down their offices at this point, which is, you can say that's it for any Wagner-Russia cooperation anymore. I mean, you can just throw that out the window. It's done. This is going to end with the end of Wagner if it's not successful for Wagner, at least in terms of any kind of cooperation. Because even if they want Ukraine support, now everyone's seeing him as this anti-Russia or anti-Putin group.
And let's not forget that I said earlier that the Wagner group's main conflicts were Libya and Syria. And the Russians lost both of those.
Yeah, I've even seen them in North Africa as well.
That'd be Libya, Gaddafi.
I think Central African Republic as well. I've heard some involvement there as well.
I'd say you're correct there as well. Yeah, but either way, in every instance, the Russians' backside lost. So they can't even go to one of those countries that they helped fight in, because the other side won that conflict. So there's no way. It's funny that Russia.
If they don't win, they're screwed. It sounds like.
Well, the people. It's funny that Russia relies on them so much, considering that they keep losing all the time. So we're going to rely on this military group that keeps losing in battles. We make them fight for us. So the track record shows that they're going to have some trouble taking in Moscow if they can't even, take out to help defend Assad.
Maybe they need a home ground advantage. I don't know. Certainly they're struggling, if you mention on that sense. But who knows what could happen in this regard. But yeah, Wagner, they are screwed if they don't win this, because they're talking about everyone's going to be neutralized, and that's, if you're hearing neutralized, I mean, you just keep fighting at that point. There's no use hiding. It's Russia.
Prigozhin has said that every single one of his soldiers is ready to die.
Right, so that's about as strong as language you can get. That is extreme there.
And yeah, they said they're going to go all the way, so they're going to obviously take it to Moscow, obviously.
Yeah, all the way is Moscow at this point. I know, obviously, Russia's a big country. Moscow is not the center or the most furthest away part, obviously, but if you're talking about taking control, I mean, Putin can flee out, but if you've got Wagner in control of Moscow, a lot of people would still say that's Wagner in charge there. It would have to be a big response from Russia there if they managed to lose Moscow, and that would be a huge loss for them, even if they could potentially benefit from it, because a months-long stalemate could happen there. This isn't like World War II we're talking about, or World War I, as Stuart outlined. Austin, I imagine that, Moscow is the last line of defense in terms of it at least looking like Russia's still in charge at this point, not Wagner, even if technically, could end up being a different way. But that's why they've got this huge border checkpoint, Neil, and then in Moscow they've got protection as well, and in the meantime they've got the air defences who are going and attacking Wagner.
Well, they've shut down, the M4. You've seen, as the footage on your screen, tanks rolling down streets. So obviously that's not Moscow, but that's what Moscow will most likely look like soon. And I just want to say something though. The first development of this today, that at least to my knowledge, was that it comes after the Wagner forces chief, who is the one leading all this, said Moscow strikes kill a, quote, huge number of Wagner forces. So that's obviously stirred something up, and it's led to this. But if they're going to go all the way, and we're seeing Moscow's governor or mayor telling residents, not to, all public events are cancelled, they're expecting the worst. And once they get there, that is the last line before, this will escalate. If it happens.
Yeah, it's a big if, isn't it? And that's what we kind of have to wait for to see. In terms of Stuart, and we've both been following Russia since the war began, and in terms of what the Russian people might think, the people in like Rostov-on-Don, they apparently are just continuing their lives as normal. There were street cleaners as the tanks rolled in, which is an incredible sight to see. But given there has been some dissent towards Putin before, as we discussed, could this turn into one of those enemies, my enemy, any enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, where they'll just be like, to heck with it, and just kind of just maybe not forcefully, but at least they'd want to back this purely because it would get rid of Putin. And this is again a somewhat realistic chance. This is not an outshot. It's an outlier. It's a actually somewhat possible. The fact we're even talking about it being possible is just amazing.
We do not know. I'm opposed to us sitting here as Westerners and saying that, they have to ally, enemy of my enemy is my friend. Because the alternative to that is better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So we keep talking the enemy of your enemy is your friend. There's two sayings, and one goes each way. So I don't think we can say that.
We'll flip a coin to see which saying is more appropriate at this point. It is speculation. I agree with you there. But it's still going to be interesting to see how this responds. And in terms of like the local governors and all that, I mean, we don't know what's going on there. And obviously, as you mentioned, it's different to how a state or a territory in Australia or something like that would operate. Obviously, it's Russia, but still, it is extraordinary. And again, but also it depends. I think it probably depends on how well, if at all, Wagner actually goes in this, because it could end up being a total failure for them.
I want to make it clear that I'm not saying Putin is a good guy. I'm not defending Putin. Having said that, I prefaced it like that.
But big but.
But there's a big but here. But to ordinary Russians, would you rather someone who claims to be democratic and who at least has some democratic values there? Of course, the opposition leader is in prison. He's not dead. Would you rather that or a military dictatorship? So we cannot... I'm opposed to us speaking here as Westerners who aren't in Russia, telling Russians whether or not they should support Prigozhin or Putin, because it's a dictator against a dictator. One's militaristic, one claims to be democratic. So we can't say, they should side with Putin or they should side with Prigozhin, because we aren't in a situation. Given how dire the situation is in Russia, I don't feel safe saying they have to go this way or that way. I think personally, as a Westerner, I think that they should side against Putin, but then the question is, you're siding with a military dictator. So it is a very, very hard question to try and ask.
No, you're right, and it's not even just a matter of whether they should, but whether they would even, and it's hard to tell. And of course, might add, you see the videos of the Wagner leader, and he just rants and raves. Like it's not, at least Putin, when you see him, at least he does look like a leader, and he's ex-KGB. He's not a dumb guy. He's not someone who just rants and raves in his speeches. He in some regard, he knows what he's doing in terms of, at least, he's managed to keep people on board for long enough, because it's been a long time in power, and this is the first time there's even come close to a coup at this point.
Yeah, the only thing we've seen other than this was elections. Again, they're rigged elections, but he at least has the formalities of being a democracy. There's at least he shuts down opposing media. He has rigged elections, but he shuts down other media, but he also allows non-state media to exist. There is non-state media. It's pro-Putin, but it's non-state media. It's a private company, supposedly.
Although at the same, it does come under a fair bit of pressure at times, though we can't doubt that. What I will say is, though, and someone has mentioned this in the chat. And again, we're talking about worst case scenario here, or not so worst case, but an important factor about whoever's in control in Russia, and that is the international relations and the weaponry there. I mean, I don't think having a militaristic leader would help their international standing at all. Like, you can lose all formalities out the window. It might. The only benefit right now of this could be is Ukraine, and even that short term, because Wagner is still anti-Ukraine. No one can't forget that.
Exactly. It's out of the frying pan. It's too hard to say at this point which one they'd rather take. Both going to go to war with Ukraine. Both, again, Wagner Group still supports Assad, Assad is still in power. He doesn't have the control he used to have. Gaddafi, of course, he's gone. Assad is still in power, so they do have some, like, they still support Assad. They supported Gaddafi when they were fighting in those countries, so they share a lot of similar values. So you're exactly right there.
We're going to head to the news in a couple of minutes, which I'm sure will help with us, so we can stop speculating for another hour. But in the meantime, Stuart, in the short term, just quickly give us in a short couple minute summary at most, what you think the next couple of hours are going to look like, based on what we're hearing in terms of there definitely being fighting, but also potentially oil being affected here for Wagner tanks, and as it stands, they're about halfway to Moscow from Rostov-on-Don.
I don't know what else to say that I haven't already said. They've got next 48 hours are going to be crucial. I don't think we're going to see any other groups come out against Putin in the next 48 hours. It's going to come down to whether or not the Wagner Group can hold any part of Moscow. If they can't even take the outskirts of Moscow when they have the advantage of surprise, when it's just the National Guard and the riot police there, and if they can't take even the outskirts of Moscow, then they're gone. If they can take at least the outskirts, and then with a chance, if they can hold the outskirts for at least 48 hours, then we could see other groups come up in protest, but we're not going to see anything until the next 48 hours have passed. It's going to be Wagner against Putin until then.
Very interesting to see how that plays out. You're just seeing that footage on screen, by the way, if for those of you who are just joining us, of that oil depot fire in Voronezh, where there are Wagner troops, and there has been reports of fighting. Just quickly, National Affairs Editor Austin Pollock, any your final thoughts about what these next few hours are going to look like, given it does seem there's some kind of movement towards Moscow, even though there might be this hold up in the meantime at this halfway point?
Yeah, and not much different to Stuart. There's not a lot we can say, obviously, but they will be continuing to move on to Moscow. They'll be likely it will slow down from getting footage and stuff in as they make their way there, which will, as we've seen the graphics that have been popping up, about 7-8 hours drive to there. But they've taken control just within the last 24 hours. This has all happened. They've taken control of Russia's South Military District headquarters. They've or Wagner chief has now gone after Putin in this statement for the first time, and countries are also foreign countries are responding to all this, and obviously 48 hours we'll see a few more developments, but then once they get to Moscow, if they make it to Moscow, we'll see it escalate for sure.
Absolutely. Austin Pollock, our National Affairs Editor, Stuart Jeffrey, the editor of GovCheck. Thank you very much as we continue this coverage. And we do, just before we head to the top of the hour headlines, we just want to repeat that breaking news about that oil depot. It now appears helicopters have been attacking it. That is apparently what we've seen. I just want, if possible, this is footage that was posted to Twitter by BNO News, citing someone else. If we can just let's just play that footage now very quickly of what has apparently happened at that oil depot.
Это пипец. Летит очень низко. Только что был взрыв. Мама! Мама! Неосторожно! Мама! Пиздец, мама! Мамочки! Это пипец.
So some pretty extraordinary footage there. Again, we'll have to wait and see through on that. But as we discussed earlier, that may very well have been Russia, trying to stop oil supplies for tanks. But look, that's in regards to Wagner. But look, we will wrap it up there from Stuart Jeffrey and Austin Pollock. Gentlemen, great to have you both for this, and we'll continue our ongoing coverage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leo.
Thank you.
Stay with us here on 6 News. We're continuing our coverage straight after this with the news on the top of the hour. Reminder, if you've got any thoughts or comments, let us know. You can comment on social media, hashtag 6newsau, or send us an email, contact@sixnewsau.com. And of course, if you want to support our ongoing coverage, help us stay independent, support us for just $4 a month at patreon.com/6newsau. And you can get exclusive benefits there. Support independent, unbiased journalism. Thank you again for tuning into this special coverage. Time now for the news. Here's Austin Pollock.
Good evening. These are the headlines on 6 News this hour, and first to breaking news. And the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group has said his forces will go all the way and says his army is ready to die as an apparently military coup is staged. Here is what we know right now. The boss of Russian mercenary group Wagner, Yevhen Prigozhin, claims his troops have marched into Russia from Ukraine. He has been accused of calling for an armed mutiny, and Russia has issued an arrest warrant. He has previously clashed with the Russian defense minister over problems on the battlefield also. The Kremlin says Vladimir Putin is receiving constant updates on the situation, with all public events in Moscow cancelled and a counter-terrorism response enacted. The Wagner chief says he has control of all military sites in Rostov-on-Don, and he has demanded to speak with Russian military officials. He claims his troops have shot down a second Russian military helicopter. That unverified footage is on your screen at the moment, and he says he will take his force all the way to Moscow. The major highway, the M4, which connects Moscow to southern regions including Rostov and near the main city Rostov-on-Don, has been closed, with footage showing armed vehicles travelling on it. The Russian army says it will guarantee the safety of Wagner fighters who stop rebelling. 6 News GovCheck editor Stuart Jeffrey says he doubts whether we'll know soon of a successful coup.
I doubt that it'll be resolved quickly, unless they manage to somehow capture Putin or knock out Putin. I doubt that he'll surrender. So Putin won't give up power easily. It will be a fight unless they can somehow get Putin himself, or whether that means assassinate him or capture him. Unless they can do that, which will also be hard to do, it will be a slog probably.
Also making news this hour, sanctions have been placed against people involved in the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, which killed 298 people, 38 Australians, while flying over Ukraine in 2014. The Australian government imposing travel bans as well as financial sanctions. And a new report has found that United States intelligence found no direct evidence of COVID-19 starting in a Wuhan lab. Republicans have, although, accused the Biden administration of withholding information, as the report cites intelligence officials were unable to determine the origins of COVID-19. Tomorrow's weather, and fine and sunny for Brisbane, top of 27 degrees, Sydney also sunny, 20, Canberra sunny, 12, Melbourne 14 and showers, Hobart 14 partly cloudy, Adelaide 15 and showers, Perth 16 degrees partly sunny, and Darwin it will be 32 and mostly sunny. Alright, and those are the latest headlines up to the minute here on 6 News. There's more news on our website, sixnewsau.com, and on social media you can find the latest by searching 6newsau to find us. More news coverage continues right after this. For now though folks, I'm Austin Pollock. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you soon.